Okay, so let's continue talking about dominant and co-cultures before we finish up discussing social institutions and the role they play in shaping culture. So dominant and co-cultures is again just dealing with cultures that tend to be really pervasive. In other words, a lot of the people around you tend to be members of them, and then co-cultures or subcultures. They tend to be cultures that are smaller, like groups that are smaller. So a dominant culture in America would be just like, for example, maybe some of the more dominant, like in terms of like high population, like ethnicity or races in the United States. So it could be something like that. It could be a religious affiliation, right? So I mentioned if you're religiously affiliated in the United States, you tend to be either a Christian Catholic denomination or a Jewish denomination. So if you're a member of one of those groups, that group itself will be a dominant culture, right? That would be an example of it. So or just even being obviously you live in North America and you're a U.S. citizen, just your nationality as a U.S. citizen is a dominant culture, right? And those dominant cultures tend to set a broad societal agenda that most of us kind of fall into in a lot of respects. Like whatever the norms, beliefs, values of that, we tend to sort of follow those. So, like, again, we live in a capitalistic society and we live capitalistic lives, right? We live in a democracy. We try to we vote. We promote that. We're like, this is a good thing, right? Whatever it may be. So whatever those beliefs, and again, if you're a religious member, whatever the beliefs are of that church or affiliation, that kind of stuff. So whatever the dominant culture kind of teaches us, we go along with it, right? So that's the dominant culture. Now, subcultures are basically these groups that are basically in the minority. So they're groups you belong to or affiliations you have that not everybody has. So an example would be, I have these images here. You've got the record and like YouTube. So I mentioned like a culture is like any group you belong to, and you kind of have shared beliefs and or behaviors. Okay. So an example of subcultures. Okay, that could be if we want to stick with some of the themes I was just talking about, like, okay, if you're a member of a religious affiliation or an ethnic minority or nationality that even though you like if you're in North America, in the United States, but maybe it's a ethnicity that's not as common, right? It's a smaller group, okay? Or it's a religious sect that's smaller. That could be a subculture, right? But I have this record player on YouTube, but like as I mentioned, it could be any group you belong to. So let's take music genres, right? You can argue that certain genres of music, like it's their own little culture, right? And if you don't believe me, like an example of that from a nonverbal dynamic would be go to any concert. You notice how everybody's dressed the same, but they're also dressed differently than if you were at a different concert, right? So what does that tell you, right? Those members are acting the same. They're all dressing the same, right? They engage in the same behavior in the sense of being a fan of that music or that band or that artist, right? And so it would be like if you're going to a country concert or a hip hop concert, right? Those people are going to dress differently. They listen, certainly they behave differently because they listen to different music, right? That'd be an example, right? Or YouTube, right? If you take like a really popular YouTube channel and let's say you've been watching it, for years and it's got a couple million subscribers, right? Like you engage in the same patterns of behavior as those other subscribers because you watch the videos, right? And you have, in terms of like mindset or beliefs, that's more of like your fandom, right, of the group. And so you're your own little culture, right? And or I mentioned before, like sports teams. So these are like these other little groups that you belong to. It could be you're a fan of something, and so you engage in that media. It could be it could be a workplace environment. It's like you go to a school, for example, and then you go to a college, you get a degree, now you're an alumni of that school, right? So you have an affiliation with them moving forward. So it could be all of these sorts of things. And again, I have a background. My master's degree in communication is focused on a lot with like media. And the reason I actually bring up music or YouTube is maybe it's a like nerdy side note, but we so media has actually created more subcultures than there used to be. So here's what I mean by that. So a lot of you guys, if you're younger, you've cut the cord. You're streaming everything now, and so. But before that, right? Go back to a time of like your parents or your. I guess it'd probably have to be your parents now. You'd be old like me, but like if you just go back, you don't have to go back that long, 20 years, right? And certainly if you go back 30 years, but like if you go, or in fact, I would say if you go back any time to like 15 years, go back 15 years and then past, right? So before the rise of like internet and streaming services and all these options, right? The world of Netflix and everything like that, right? So what would happen is you'd have a popular movie or a show, and there would really be a shared experience. So, for example, when it came to like a show, well, it wasn't like today where you have literally hundreds of channels to choose from, right? And so many shows to choose from. It was more like if you had cable, 50 channels and only so many shows. And a lot of people didn't have cable. If you go back to if you're going to go back to the early 2000s and 90s and 80s, right? And so if a show was popular, like Seinfeld, for example, which I think was popular in the mid to late 90s, to give you an example of a classic show, or even Friends, right? Classic shows that are popular. When that show was popular and a hit, everybody saw it, right? And so there was this shared experience in the culture. Like most Americans at that time were watching Seinfeld. And they could talk about it around the water cooler or the next day, wherever, right? But if you think about a show now, so a show now, though, because we're so fragmented, so you have so many more choices between literal channels, if you haven't cut the cord, to if you have in the streaming services, all those choices, right? So now you have so many choices that if a show is popular now, it's not like Seinfeld where the odds are at least one out of every two neighbors saw it and could talk to you about it. Now a show could be popular and you could go to 10 straight neighbors and not only did they not see it, they've never heard of it. Right? So in other words, my little nerdy point here is that because of how media has changed, it's so fragmented now. It's okay. On one hand, you have individual choice and arguably better content, and that's all great. But it's actually created less of a shared experience because now there's still cultures. So like if you're a fan of White Lotus, a show that's popular right now, and you watch that, okay, your other fans of that show are in that little group with you. And even cast members in the sense of you're a fan of the show and them and all the sorts, right? But my point is, like, I've never seen White Lotus. I've heard of it. I've never seen a single episode. Don't really have an interest in it. Right. And there's going to be a lot more people that haven't than have. Right. It's like this small little group. So it's just weird now in that media still, or YouTube's another example of that. Right. Like a popular YouTube channel, still, like most people on YouTube have not, probably ever seen a video from that channel. Like you name the channel, right? Because it's just so fragmented. And that's how, like, sometimes you've probably experienced this where you run into a channel with like I ran into a channel the other day that already has over 2 million subscribers, super popular, been around forever. I never heard of it. Just happened to run into it now, right? And so one of the weird, I guess my point is like in modern times, these little groups we belong to, when it comes to media, when it comes to movies and shows, it's way more fragmented now because we have so many choices. And so it creates less of a shared experience. And I guess to wrap up my nerdy point is when there's less of a shared experience, then the show or the film, it has a harder time having a big impact on the world or on society, right? So in other words, White Lotus can be a great show, or Breaking Bad, or I'm trying to name like recent amazing shows, right, that were super popular when I say that, or Game of Thrones or something like that. But it's harder for it to have the same cultural significance. Or pick a movie too, right? Because less people saw it. It affected less people in the culture, right? So a show like Seinfeld or The Sopranos, maybe if you want to compare a more serious show, right? The Sopranos can have such a big cultural impact because at its time, if people had cable, there's only so many options, and HBO was like the big one, right? And so it just reached more people. The Sopranos, I guess I'm trying to say is The Sopranos reaches more people than White Lotus. Just literally more viewers. So it's going to have a bigger cultural impact. So I don't know if that matters to you. Maybe that's a nerdy side tangent, but just wanted to point out that like one of the differences in today's world versus your parents is that we don't have shared experience around things as much anymore. And so therefore those things can't impact us the same way because it's just not as many people know about it because we just don't share it, right? So I don't know. Just a little side note of one of the changes that's happened with media. So again, any culture you belong to, any of those little groups, those are little cultures too, right? So any group you belong to with shared practices, shared beliefs, that's a culture. And I just want to point out there's these like sub ones, these small ones. Social institutions. So the reason I'm bringing this up is because social institutions have a tendency to really teach us the values and the ways of behaving, right? So the beliefs and behavior that make up a culture. So what are the social institutions? You've got your family. Can't live with them, can't live without them. I don't know. Because we all have different opinions of our family. I like my family. Pretty cool. It's okay. So they tend to be the chief socializing agent. So what I mean by that is they're the first on the scene, right? Your parents, your siblings, and they tend to they're the first ones and the main ones that socialize our values and like norms of behavior, right? We learn from our parents, from our siblings, right? Those people that are sort of in our formative years as we go up, right? And that's kind of universal to all cultures. All cultures value the family unit, and the family unit plays that huge role. And it's also even as a concept by many social institutions, they try to talk about being a family, right? Like certainly you see this in organizational communication where companies will talk about we're a family or we're a part of the same team, right? They try to use that kind of connection. They try to like reapply it. And to give you an example of like the impact of family and like with communication would be, so I also teach interpersonal communication. And in that class, we'll have a whole section on relationship dynamics. And one of the relationships dynamics in terms of like how family affects relationships, and obviously family itself is a relationship. To give an example of this is, and how like family is like the chief initial socialization and a big part of it is. So look at it this way. Somebody's growing up in a family. One of the chief socialization agent for them to learn about how relationships work is from their parents. Right? So you're growing up, you see how your parents behave, how they treat each other, and you're kind of learning subtly this is what a relationship looks like. All right? And that can be for good or bad. So if you grow up in a family, and this is how you treat people, right? Based on how your parents treat each other, how they treat your siblings. And again, that can be good or bad, but you're learning that family is socializing you in the most powerful way about what relationships, how they go, right? How you should act. And so an example would be, it's interesting. So this is why, for example, sometimes uh, people they grow up in say an abusive family or relationship, and then they go out, right, and they become abusers themselves, abusive in whatever way you want to apply. Or I have members of my family that are teachers, and it absolutely, almost it feels like 9 times out of 10 when they do like the parent teacher conferences, right? And you've got the second, third, so they teach in like elementary school, and like the second or third grader, and the kid is really mouthy, has a terrible attitude, really disrespectful to the other teachers, all this kinds of stuff, right? And 9 times out of 10, the parents come in, and guess what? They're treating each other that way. And it's like, so you're shocked little Billy has an attitude problem and is disrespectful, and you guys are like disrespectful to each other left and right in front of Billy, right? So what are you teaching that kid? Now that extends beyond the relationship, right? You're teaching them about how to communicate and how should you respect people? Does that matter, right? And so again, kids, that's an example of this. So like how the family socializes you in terms of communication, because as you grow up, the only model you have for a relationship is your parents. and not just the relationship they have with each other, but again, how they treat your siblings and how they treat you. And it teaches you how to communicate, how to treat each other, and what a relationship looks like, right? Um, so that's just an example of the family unit playing a big role in socializing people. But again, it's first on the scene, obviously, before you get exposed to media, friends, schools, and all that kind of stuff, right? Or just, the general society at large. So obviously it plays a big role. History plays a big role. So the history that we're taught, it kind of tells us, first of all, we tend to be taught a version of history, right? Based on our group's perspective and their experiences. And it also tends to provide insights into the values that we have, our traditions, our social institutions. So it teaches us about them, right? And also like what we value, what matters to us, right? And so history just kind of it imports all this onto us, right? And in a certain way. And again, it differs usually based on our experience, right? And our group's experience with that history. So, we tend to be taught a version of it based on what was our experience. Okay. And that obviously then gets passed down to everybody. And you may have heard that phrase, like people use the phrase, the victors write history. I don't know if you've ever heard that, but essentially what that is saying is, look, if I'm the winner, I get to control the narrative, and I'm going to write a narrative that makes me look good, right? Or that's the best interpretation of an event. And there's some truth to that, obviously. I think probably a more intellectually honest way to discuss that concept is that you're going to tell history from your perspective, right? And your perspective is always naturally, of course, going to look at something in the best way possible, right? For you, kind of thing, right? So it's like Christopher Columbus. We have Columbus Day, discovered America, right? We're third grade, our history books tell us this, right? Now, if I'm, it's 2025, I'm a U.S. citizen. I, born here. My parents grew up here, right? I read about Christopher Columbus, right? America's my home, and like it. It's awesome. Okay. So I'm really glad Christopher Columbus discovered America, right? And so I'm gonna look at it as like, okay, that's a great thing. But obviously, there's different views of that history, right? There's a lot of people who don't think Christopher Columbus is like a great dude, right? It depends on which, So in other words, there were groups here before Christopher Columbus. And if you're a member of any of those groups, you probably don't view him because of your experience, right? Not because of bias or anything else, because of your experience with it, as necessarily a great thing for your group or your people, right? Because there's a lot of other groups and people that would have a bone to pick with Christopher Columbus. Don't think he's like a good dude, right? But that's their experience, not my experience. My experience is like I'm here and I'm glad I'm here. Like I don't know, right? And so history kind of like shapes a perspective, I guess is what I'm trying to say. And a lot of historical events there's two sides to the story, right? And one side sees it as a good thing, one side might see it as a bad, or two sides see it as bad, or two sides see it as good for different reasons. And I guess what I'm trying to say, I don't know if I used a lot of great examples in this lecture for some reason. I don't know, I'm a little off. I guess what I'm trying to say is that whatever that perspective is, it's usually shared by a culture, right? Good or bad, or a version of good or a version of bad. And they teach everybody that same history, right? Tends to be what happens. So history plays a role, family plays a role, mass media obviously does. Again, that's a lot of my background as far as studying of communication. So mass media here, it plays a role in a couple of ways. One of the real big ways is that it often just reflects an image of a culture's deep structure. So usually mass media kind of reflects what that society or culture values, or how they view. Even that better than values. The right way to phrase it is, what you will see in media is often a reflection of the norms and beliefs, specifically the norms of that culture at the time. It's like a time capsule. And a good way that you can like just experience is again, look at movies and shows. You ever go back and you watch a movie that's a couple years old, and just the way people are acting or their way they dress, the way they talk, you can tell when it was made, right? Because it's reflect. But sometimes you can also just tell things because it reflects certain things in the culture. You know, an example of this is like, and it's before my time, but even I know, like if you go back to like shows and like television shows in like the 1950s and 60s, right? Um, where like you would have couples, right? Let's say it's a sitcom, right? And you would have the married couple in the sitcom. If there was a scene in the show where it's at night and they're going to bed, they would actually be in separate beds. So it'd be like two beds in the room. Because at that time on television, it was seen as kind of risque, right? The morals of the time was like, you know, you don't show the two people in bed together. Like that's that's a little taboo, right? That's a reflection of the morals of the time being bared out in the show, right? Or being bore out in the show, right? Or obviously you can see this in themes of the shows, right? Where maybe some of the moral themes now seem a little corny or not, you know, or something like that. But at the time, like that's what you did in shows. You reflected that, right? Like think of like the Leave It to Beaver type of a show, right? And so that's an example of this. You can see it in films or music videos or things like that, or just lyrics, right? Like think about especially if people thought it was offending something, right? They get all upset. But you know, this is just an example where you can see this stuff kind of reflected in the culture. So a lot of times, what mass media is it's like it's a mirror. It's like telling the culture. It's like a mirror, not telling. It's a mirror showing us what we are, right? So like I think shows and movies are the best example of that kind of mirror. And just like if you watched a show now or a movie now, it would reflect what you, right, what the current generation thinks is okay, right, or how they live their life, right, and what they value and what's important to them. And it's just different, right? Like shows are different now. So, um, which is also a reason I think, by the way, it's unfair to judge shows. Like sometimes people they go back and they look at movies, or they look at a show, and they get upset about something like, "Oh, that's not okay." And it's like, well, I mean, is that fair to judge it based on a different time period, right? Because at the time that they made the show or the movie, that was considered okay, right? Like, or it wasn't something offensive. So I think sometimes it's unfair to like Monday morning quarterback judge these things because they're reflections of society. Now, I will say, so it tends to reflect it, which also means it socializes us into what to think and believe, right? Again, and how to behave. So it reflects on us things about our culture, right? About what to think and believe, which then also in turn socializes us like, okay, this is what I should think and believe, right? And then we go out and we follow suit. Now, it's a mirror. Now, obviously, maybe the elephant in the room for some of you is now look, there's obviously aspects of media that are trying to purposely socialize us to certain things, right? In other words, financial interests. So, like, just take advertising, right? Or in the modern example, would be influencers, right? Influencers on social media for a financial incentive are trying to influence the culture to believe, think, and behave in certain ways. Whether it's consume certain products or adopt a certain belief, there's a financial motive there. So, in other words, some of this is media is just, hey, you know, we're just showing you, we're a show, like a show or a movie, right? We're just like reflecting the way the current society is, okay, to tell us how we are. But some of it obviously is strategic, and that's where you get into advertising and stuff like that, and influencers and stuff. So obviously that's an element too, and sometimes that works, and sometimes it doesn't work. One of the things too is like the proliferation of mass media and obviously the internet and technologies like that. So I mentioned the streaming before and cutting the cord. You know, when you add all these choices now, and we have all this connectivity now, you're just like, if you've got a computer, you're just connected to the whole world. That has then led to us having increased exposure to all these other cultures and all their other norms and patterns of behavior. Obviously, that can be a really good thing because that exposure, first of all, we can just find things that are cool and awesome that we like, right, from other cultures and groups that we wouldn't have a chance to experience before. It can the other advantage is it can increase understanding too. And so, like, for example, research into like negative stereotypes or bias and all that kind of stuff, right, shows that one of the best ways to sort of get rid of that, or for people to have more understanding of people from divergent cultures, is just friggin' expose them to the group, right? A lot of times people have opinions about a certain group, or they dislike a certain group of people, but they've never dealt with them in their lives. They've just been told about them, about the evildoers, right? Never actually interacted with them, never sat down with them, never actually dealt with them, right? They just hate them. And so research in this shows that, like, if you make those people actually deal with the person they hate, the other, that's actually the technical research term, once they're around them, the more they're around them, exposed to them, guess what? That usually tends to go away. Because they start to realize, like, oh, you're not so bad after all, right? And so another advantage too is because we're so connected now to the world through the internet and through just choices, like going back to streaming, we're getting exposed to all these other groups, which means we're also developing understanding of them, right, and appreciation for them. So that's another sort of advantage. Now, I will say there's a disadvantage, though. By the way, one of the disadvantages from a media standpoint is when you have all of this exposure, sometimes you'll have some cultural groups influencing other cultural groups in a negative way, or imposing on the other group, and so therefore in a way that's harmful. So it's sort of like, here's this group's perspective, here's your perspective, and we're trying to like force our will on you. So it kind of has like pros and cons, but certainly mass media, man, they're right there. And by the way, speaking of imposing, this gets to a concept you've probably heard of this in other classes before. It called ethnocentrism. So what ethnocentrism basically is when you evaluate another group based on your group's standards, right? So somebody else does something and you're like, that's right or wrong. And well, why? Well, because it's what we think is right, or it's what we think it's wrong, so therefore it's wrong, right? Or we think it's right, so therefore it's right. Instead of asking yourself, what would somebody in that group, in their position, in their situation, how would they evaluate it, right? You've got to judge it based on the stand. I guess what I'm saying is there's a real argument that the fairest thing to do, is the most honest thing to do, is to judge it based on the standards of their group, right? That their perspective, what does their perspective say about it? So if you're coming, obviously, for example, I'm a member of American culture. And so it's be like if I looked at something another country did, or another country, and I was like judging that group or that nationality, or maybe an ethnicity different than mine, right? And I was judging them based on, say, maybe the moral standards of American culture, but not the standards of their culture, right? Which might be completely different. And so when you say somebody's being ethnocentric, what you're saying is you're basically making the argument that that is not fair, right? That you need to judge them by their own standards, I guess is the simplest way to put it. Now, is there a pushback to that, right? Like, is there an opposing argument? Maybe. Like, an opposing argument could be like, maybe you're just right, right? Like, now, I think that is very rare where you get in those situations. But look, there's some situations where you could make the argument of, well, yeah, I'm not judging them by their standards, but they're still wrong, right? Like, so an example would be, I talked about earlier, just to kind of wrap this up. Earlier I mentioned like television shows and movies that came out at different times, right? To where, if you're watching a show that came out even as recently as like even the 90s or early 2000s, there are sitcoms, for example, or movies in the 90s and early 2000s that if that movie or show came out now, people get upset about certain things. They'd be like, whoa, you shouldn't do that. So this is an example of that. So let's say there's a sitcom and it's got some jokes in there, or a film that has some jokes, and it's like, by today's standard, that would be kind of not okay. That'd be offensive, right? And so if you looked at that and you said that is not okay, that's offensive, or you should not have done that, it was poor taste, what have you, whatever. So on one hand, you could say that's ethnocentrism, right? Because I'm judging them by the standards of today, whatever we deem is acceptable today. But on the other hand, maybe we're right today. Oh, sorry, cramp. Maybe we're right today. Like, in other words, maybe we were wrong in the 90s when we thought that was an okay joke, right? Or an okay theme, a joke to have in the film or the show, right? So maybe we're just right and they were wrong. And it wasn't the standard at the time, but man, you do better, right? Like, so I'm just playing devil's advocate. I'm just telling you hypothetically, there are situations, I guess, where an ethnocentrism thing could be, you can make those arguments. But again, you can also argue the other side, which I mentioned earlier in this video, where I had said, you could also say it's not fair, that you need to kind of look at those things and say, well, at the time, where were we at on that, right? Like, was it, so. And comedy, of course, brings up other dynamics, right? Because with comedy, you're also dealing with dynamics of just this notion of um, comedy is meant not to be taken literal or serious all the time, right? And so it doesn't necessarily mean that it's meant in a way to be offensive. So anyway, hopefully that kind of makes sense about ethnocentrism. So it's the criticism that you're approaching something from the perspective, right, of your group only and not the group that applies. So that wraps up our discussion on cultural dynamics. Thanks for joining me, and I will see you guys in our next video topic.